The air at the Miller Estate auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of late August dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the faint, sad smell of rust returning to the earth. It was 1973. For most farmers in Black Hawk County, these were golden times. Corn was pushing $3 a bushel, beans were over $6. Money was flowing like water, and the banks were practically giving it away. You could feel it in the swagger of the crowd, the crisp new bills pulled from worn leather wallets. I stood near the back, my hands tucked into the pockets of my worn denim jacket, feeling the smooth, familiar shape of the few folded 20s I'd brought. My name is Earl Armstrong. I farmed the 240 acres my grandfather broke with a team of mules, the same land my father tilled with a Farmall M. I was making it work with a John Deere 4020. I'd bought used and paid off in 2 seasons, a planter that was older than I was, and a whole lot of sweat. I didn't owe a dime to any man or any bank, and I slept soundly because of it. That's why I wasn't here for the main event. I wasn't interested in the late-model International Harvester 1066 with the gleaming red paint and air-conditioned cab that was drawing all the attention. I was watching the junk line, the row of forgotten iron sitting silent in the tall grass at the edge of the grove. That's where the real bargains were, if you had the eyes to see and the hands to make them right. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Haynes, was working the crowd like a preacher. His voice, amplified by a squawking horn speaker on his truck, was a hypnotic rhythm of numbers and cajoling. "Look at this beauty, gentlemen. A 1066 with only 1,500 hours. The plastic is still on the buddy seat. Who'll give me $30,000? $30,000 for the pride of the county." A hand shot up. Richard Peterson. Of course, Rich had inherited the section next to me and in 5 short years had leveraged it into an empire of rented ground and brand new equipment. He stood there in a clean seed corn hat and polished boots, a smug grin on his face. He didn't farm, he managed assets. He drove a new Lincoln to the co-op and talked about depreciation schedules and tax write-offs more than he ever talked about the weather. "30,000 from Mr. Peterson. Do I hear 31? Bill's head swiveled. Rich just shook his head, a dismissive wave of his hand. He knew no one else would touch it. He was buying power, buying status. The tractor was sold with a bang of the gavel, and a ripple of impressed murmurs went through the crowd. Rich took a slow drag from his cigarette, the king surveying his court. I turned my attention back to the junk line. And then I saw it. It was a monster. A Massey Ferguson 760 combine, sitting like a beached whale, its faded red paint peeling and its massive grain head sagging into the weeds. It was one of the biggest combines of its day, a V8 diesel behemoth that was supposed to eat 8 rows of corn for breakfast. This one looked like it hadn't eaten in a decade. One of the huge rear tires was flat, the rubber cracked and split to the cords. The windows of the cab were milky with grime, and a family of starlings had built a nest in the unloading auger. A thick, dark stain of old oil coated the side of the engine compartment, a telltale sign of a catastrophic failure. It was scrap. Everyone knew it. Old man Miller had bought it new, pushed it hard for 2 seasons until the big Perkins diesel gave up the ghost. The story was he'd thrown a rod right through the side of the block. Instead of fixing it, he'd just bought a new gleaner and parked the Massey where it died. That was 6 years ago. The auctioneer and the crowd finally ambled over to the junk line. They sold off a rusty hay rake for $50 and a set of cultivators for $100. Then Bill Haynes pointed a dismissive thumb at the combine. "All right, boys, what am I bid for this piece of yard art?" "We're selling it for scrap, 2 tons of it at least." Tires are shot, engines locked up tighter than a banker's wallet. "Gotta haul it out of here yourself. Who'll give me $500 for the whole shebang?" Silence. Even the crickets seemed to stop chirping. $500 was the price of a decent sow. No one wanted to spend that much just for the headache of cutting it up and hauling it away. $400, Bill tried again, his voice losing its rhythm. $300, just to get it gone. I felt a strange pull. I'd worked on diesels my whole life. I knew the sound of a healthy engine and the sickening silence that followed a major failure. But I also knew that sometimes what looked like a catastrophe was just a collection of broken parts waiting for a patient hand. $100, I said, my voice quiet but clear in the sudden lull. Heads turned, Eyes widened. I saw smirks and pitying looks. Then I heard a loud braying laugh. It was Rich Peterson. He pushed his way to the front, clapping a hand on my shoulder that was meant to be friendly but felt like an anchor. "Earl, my boy, what in God's name are you going to do with that thing? Plant flowers in the grain tank?" He boomed, playing to the crowd. "You could buy a running combine for what it'll cost you to haul that anchor home." "Just thinking about the scrap price, Rich," I said, not looking at him. My eyes were tracing the lines of the machine, picturing the engine mounts, the hydraulic hoses, the maze of belts and chains. $100 from the man who likes a challenge, the auctioneer chirped, seizing the moment. "Do I hear 150? 110? Sold. For $100 to Earl Armstrong." The gavel fell, and it sounded like a starting pistol. A wave of laughter rippled through the men. I felt my ears burn, but I kept my face a mask of stone. I walked to the clerk's table and counted out 5 worn $20 bills. The title was a greasy folded piece of paper that simply said, "For salvage." As I pocketed the receipt, Rich strolled over, shaking his head with a theatrical sigh. "Earl, I like you, I really do. But you're stuck in the past. Look at this." He swept his arm out, indicating the new 1066 he'd just bought. "That's the future. Power, efficiency. I'll have my beans out in 3 days while you're still trying to figure out which end of that relic the key goes in." "It'll do the job," I said, my voice tight. "Doing the job isn't enough anymore," he shot back, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's about leverage. The bank gave me a line of credit at 7%. 7? It's practically free money. I'm buying Henderson's 80 acres next spring. You should think about it. That 4020 of yours is a fine tractor for a museum. You could trade it in, get a new one, finance the rest, expand. You gotta grow, Earl, or you die." "I'd rather own 1 acre free and clear than be making payments on 1,000, I said, looking him square in the eye. He just laughed again, a short, sharp bark. "That kind of thinking is what put Old Man Miller in the ground. You have fun with your new project." He turned and walked away, the crowd parting for him like he was Moses and they were the Red Sea. I stood there for a long time, the greasy title in my hand, the laughter of my neighbors still ringing in my ears. I looked at the massive dead machine. Everyone saw a pile of scrap metal, a monument to failure. I saw something else. I saw a challenge. I saw a path to staying independent, to owing nothing to anyone. It was a mountain of steel and problems, but if I could conquer it, it would be mine, all mine. But before we get into the grease and grime of this rebuild, the long nights under a single bare bulb in the workshop, and the skinned knuckles and broken bolts, I have to ask you all a question. Have you ever taken on a project that everyone, and I mean everyone, said was impossible? A piece of equipment, a business deal, a promise you made to yourself? Drop a comment below and let me know what it was and how it turned out. Because right then, standing in that field, I was making a promise to myself, and I had no idea if I could keep it. Getting the Massey home was the first ordeal. It was 15 tons of dead weight, and a professional heavy hauler wanted $200, twice what I'd paid for the machine, to move it the 4 miles to my farm. That was out of the question. So I spent a day with a bottle jack and timber blocks, wrestling the one good rear tire off and swapping it with one of the front steering tires, which at least held air. Then I aired up the other front tire and used a come-along to winch the massive flat-spotted drive tire until the worst of the split was off the ground. The next morning, I drove my 4020 over. The John Deere looked like a pony next to an elephant. I hooked a heavy logging chain to the combine's solid front axle, put the 4020 in its lowest gear, and began the slow, torturous journey home. It was a spectacle. The combine groaned and protested, its unlubricated bearings screaming. I was pulling so hard, the front wheels of the 4020 were barely touching the ground. Cars slowed down, drivers gawking at the fool dragging a mountain of scrap down the county road. I saw Rich Peterson drive by in his Lincoln. He didn't wave, he just slowed, shook his head, and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust and derision. It took me 6 hours to go 4 miles. By the time I backed it into the space between my barn and the machine shed, the sun was setting, painting the peeling red paint in hues of orange and purple. It looked less like a machine and more like a wound on the landscape. My wife, Martha, came out onto the back porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The look on her face said it all. What have you done? That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the familiar night sounds of the farm, but my mind was in the yard, circling that combine. I was mentally disassembling it, trying to diagnose the unseen damage. A thrown rod was bad. Very bad. It meant a hole in the engine block, a bent crankshaft, a ruined piston. It meant a full rebuild, if it was even possible. The next day I started. I pressure-washed away years of caked-on grease, bird droppings, and grime. Underneath the filth, the metal was surprisingly solid. Miller had parked it on high ground. I drained the fuel tank, and a foul-smelling brown sludge dribbled out. The hydraulics were bone dry. For a week I did nothing but clean and assess. I followed every wire, traced every hydraulic line, checked every belt for dry rot. I was creating a map of the machine in my mind. The mockery from the community was relentless. When I went to the co-op for feed, old-timers would ask me if I was getting good scrap prices. At church, people would pat me on the shoulder with pity. The worst was at the diner in town, the unofficial headquarters for county gossip. I'd sit at the counter with a cup of coffee, and I could hear the whispers. Lost his mind. Pride's gonna make him go broke. Trying to prove something to Peterson. Rich was always there, holding court in a corner booth. He never spoke to me directly about it, but he'd talk loud enough for me to hear. Fella's gotta know when to cut his losses, he'd say to his buddies. Some iron is just meant to be melted down and turned into something useful, like a new tractor. I ignored them. I spent my days on my own farm work, and my nights and weekends belonged to the Massey. The engine was the heart of the problem. It was a Perkins 540, a massive V8 diesel that was powerful but notoriously complex. Getting to it was a job in itself. I had to disconnect the main drive shafts and unbolt the huge side panels. Using a chain hoist hung from the rafters of my machine shed, I lifted the engine cover. The sight that greeted me made my stomach clench. The rumors were true. There, on the left side of the block, was a jagged fist-sized hole. The number 3 connecting rod had snapped, shot out like a cannonball, and taken a chunk of the cast-iron block with it. The inside of the engine compartment was coated in a thick black film of old oil. It was a mortal wound. Any sane man would have quit right there. Called the scrapyard, taken his $50 a ton, and admitted defeat. But I'm not always a sane man. I'm a stubborn one. I saw that hole not as an end, but as a puzzle. For 2 nights, I just sat on an upturned bucket, staring at it, a single trouble light casting long shadows. I drank lukewarm coffee and thought. The block was ruined. Finding a new one for a 540 Perkins was like searching for hen's teeth. But maybe, just maybe, it could be repaired. I'd heard of old-time machinists who could stitch cast iron, a delicate process of preheating, welding with nickel rod, and a slow, controlled cool-down. It was more art than science. I found such a man in the next county over. An old German named Gus who ran a small machine shop behind his house. He was semi-retired, mostly working on pulling tractors for local kids. I drove over and showed him pictures I'd taken. He studied them through thick spectacles, stroking his white beard. "Ja, she is broken good," he said, his accent thick. "The block is scrap. But maybe not." He told me if I could pull the engine, strip it down to the bare block and bring it to him, he would look at it. He made no promises and quoted me a price that made me swallow hard. It was more than I'd paid for the whole combine, but it was a fraction of the cost of a new engine, if one could even be found. The decision was made. For the next month, I tore that Perkins V8 down, piece by piece. I disconnected the fuel lines, the radiator hoses, the labyrinth of wiring. I unbolted the heavy transmission. Finally, using the chain hoist and a set of heavy straps, I wrestled the engine block free from the combine's chassis. It swayed precariously, a 2,000-pound hunk of iron, before I lowered it onto a reinforced wagon. Every nut and bolt fought me. They were rusted solid, frozen by time and neglect. I broke 3 wrenches and skinned every knuckle on both hands. I soaked everything in penetrating oil, heated stubborn bolts with a torch until they glowed cherry red, and beat on them with a 3-pound hammer until my arms ached. My hands were permanently stained with grease and rust. At night, Martha would silently clean and bandage the cuts. her disapproval a quiet weight in the room. She thought I was chasing a ghost, pouring good money and precious time into a pile of junk, while our own farm needed attention. She was right to worry, but I couldn't stop. Finally, the day came. I had the engine stripped down to the bare block. It was a greasy, heavy skeleton. I loaded it onto my flatbed trailer and drove it to Gus's shop. He spent an hour examining it, measuring the hole, tapping the surrounding metal with a small hammer, listening to the sound. The main bearing journals are not cracked. The cylinder walls have some scoring, but can be bored, he finally announced. The hole, it is in a bad spot, but not impossible. He agreed to try. Come back in 1 month, he said, and bring cash. That month was one of the longest of my life. The 70s were roaring on, and the world of agriculture was changing at lightning speed. The fall of 1973 saw the beginning of the oil crisis. Fuel prices started to creep up. The old-timers at the diner grumbled, but the younger guys, the ones like Rich Peterson, just laughed it off. Their new tractors were more efficient, they argued. They could cover more ground on a tank of diesel. They were signing contracts for the next year's crop at prices nobody had ever dreamed of. The mood in the county was electric, a gold rush fever. Everyone was expanding, everyone was borrowing. The local Production Credit Association had a line out the door every morning. Farmers were buying the parcel next door, then the one after that. They were tearing down old barns to put up massive grain bins and machine sheds that looked like airplane hangars. The sound of progress was the constant roar of new diesel engines and the beep, beep, beep of equipment backing up. And then there was my farm. Quiet, my 40/20 purred along, reliable as the sunrise. My old 6-row planter put the seed in the ground straight and true. I was making good money, better than my father ever had. The high grain prices were a blessing. But I wasn't leveraging it. I took my profits and paid off my operating loan for the year by July. I bought a new set of tires for the 40/20 and paid for them with cash. I put the rest of the money in a savings account at the local bank, where it earned a meager 5% interest. My neighbors thought I was a fool. "Earl, you're sitting on a gold mine and you're not even digging," one of them told me at the co-op. "You could use this year's profit to buy that quarter section south of you. The bank will loan you the rest. In 2 years, the land will be worth twice what you paid for it." It was tempting. Lord, it was tempting. I saw the brand new 4-wheel drive Steigers rolling out of the dealership. I saw the 24-row planters that could seed a field in an afternoon. I saw Rich Peterson, who had just bought another 160 acres, bringing his total to over 1,000. He'd torn down the old farmhouse on it and was putting up a new harvester silo. He was the picture of success, the embodiment of the new American farmer. And I was the throwback, the man with the 30-year-old planter and the combine in pieces in his yard. The man who still believed that $1 in the bank was worth more than $10 of debt. The contrast was never sharper than one afternoon when I was driving home and passed Rich's place. He had his new IH-1066 hooked to a massive chisel plow, turning over black earth with a roar you could hear a mile away. Parked near his new machine shed was a brand new International Harvester 915 combine, its paint so shiny it hurt to look at. It was everything my Massey wasn't, new, reliable, and bought with the bank's money. He was ready for the boom. I drove on to my own place. The first thing I saw was the Massey 760, still sitting there, its engine bay empty and gaping like an open mouth. It looked more pathetic than ever. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into my heart. Was I wrong? Was I just a stubborn old fool, clinging to the past while the future was passing me by? Was Rich right? Grow or die? That evening, the phone rang. It was Gus. "The block is done," he said. "Come and get it." The next morning, I drove to his shop. He had the engine block sitting on a stand. I walked around it, my heart pounding. The hole was gone. In its place was a patch of new metal, a neat lattice work of welds, ground down almost perfectly smooth. It was a work of art. "Had to bore her 30 over, Gus said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You will need new pistons, new rings." The crankshaft was bent. I straightened it. "New bearings all around. She will be stronger than before. If," he added, pointing a greasy finger at me, "you put her together right." I paid him in cash, my entire savings from the year's crop. As I loaded the heavy block onto my trailer, I felt a surge of hope. It was a long way from being a running engine, but it was a start. The heart had been healed. As I drove home, the local radio station was on. The announcer was talking about the economy. He used a word I hadn't heard much before: inflation. He said the price of everything was going up, and the Federal Reserve was talking about raising interest rates to cool things down. At the end of the report, a banker from Des Moines came on. "For years, we've enjoyed stable, low interest rates," he said in a calm, measured voice. "But farmers and businessmen should be prepared. The future may require a different approach to financing. Variable rate loans, while attractive now, carry a certain risk." I turned onto my road and saw Rich Peterson's farm gleaming in the afternoon sun. He was a man betting everything on the idea that the good times would last forever, that the price of corn would only go up and the cost of money would stay down. And in the back of my truck, I had a resurrected engine block paid for with cash, a tangible piece of my own stubborn philosophy. The radio announcer's words hung in the air, a quiet, chilling premonition of a storm gathering just over the horizon, a storm that no one else seemed to see coming. The winter of '73 bled into the spring of '74, and the Massey's Perkins V8 sat on a heavy-duty engine stand in the center of my workshop. It was my other life. By day, I was a farmer, preparing the 40-20 for planting, mending fences, worrying over the price of seed. But by night, under the stark glare of a single 100-watt bulb, I was a surgeon. The repaired block was the patient, and I was bringing it back from the dead. I ordered the parts from a catalog out of Kansas City. New pistons, .030 over, a full set of rings, wrist pins, and bearings. A gasket kit that cost more than a good pair of boots. The parts arrived in cardboard boxes, each piece wrapped in oil paper, smelling of rust preventative and possibility. I laid them out on a clean workbench like a collection of jewels. The work was slow, meticulous. I honed the cylinder walls with a drill-mounted hone, the stones whispering against the cast iron, creating a perfect crosshatch pattern to seat the new rings. I checked the crankshaft journals with a micrometer, then laid the new bearings in their saddles. I used plastigage, a thin thread of wax, to check the oil clearance, torquing the main caps down, then removing them to check the flattened wax against a paper guide. Everything had to be perfect. A thousandth of an inch was the difference between a running engine and another pile of scrap. While I worked, the world outside my shop door kept spinning faster. Rich Peterson bought another 200 acres, this time on contract. He was farming nearly 2 sections of land now. His operation was the talk of the county. He had 2 new 1066 tractors and a new 4-wheel drive Steiger. He hired 2 full-time men just to run the equipment. The lights of his tractors could be seen working in the fields long after midnight, an empire of steel carving up the dark earth. He was a machine, and the banks were his fuel. By late summer, the engine was coming together. I installed the camshaft, timing it precisely with the crankshaft. I slid the new pistons, heavy with their new rings, into the cylinders, tapping them home with the wooden handle of a hammer. Finally, the cylinder heads, their valves freshly lapped, were lowered into place. I followed the torque sequence for the head bolts religiously, a spiral pattern starting from the center, tightening them in stages, 50 foot-pounds, then 90, then the final turn to 135. It was a ritual of patience. One sweltering evening in August, it was time. I had used the chain hoist to lower the complete engine back into the combine's chassis. For a week, I'd been reconnecting everything: the fuel lines, the radiator, the drive shaft, the tangled mess of the wiring harness. I filled the crankcase with 30 quarts of fresh Rotella oil and primed the fuel system, cracking the injector lines one by one until a clear stream of diesel squirted out, free of air bubbles. Martha stood on the back porch, watching. She hadn't said a word about the combine in months, but I knew she was holding her breath. I climbed into the dusty cab. The seat cushion was cracked, smelling of mouse nests and decay. I turned the key. The solenoid clicked, but nothing happened. My heart sank. I checked the batteries. They were new, fully charged. I traced the starter cable. The connection at the solenoid was green with corrosion. I climbed down, cleaned it with a wire brush until it shone, and tightened it down hard. I climbed back into the cab, took a deep breath, and turned the key again. This time, the big starter motor engaged with a heavy groan. The massive V8 turned over, once, twice, slowly, fighting its own compression. It coughed out a puff of black smoke. I gave it a little throttle. It turned faster, chugging, then a single cylinder fired, then another. The whole machine shuddered as the engine caught, belching a cloud of blue and black smoke that momentarily blotted out the setting sun. It settled into a rough, loping idle, the sound a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated through the steel floorboards and up into my bones. It was the sound of life. A slow grin spread across my face. On the porch, Martha put a hand to her mouth, and I saw her shoulders relax. I let it run for 20 minutes, my eyes glued to the oil pressure and temperature gauges. Both needles held steady in the green. The beast was alive. The first harvest with the Massey was a trial by fire. The fall of 75 was wet, the ground soft. The combine, with its sheer weight, was a monster in the mud, but its big tires and V8 power pulled it through where lighter machines were getting stuck. It wasn't pretty. The cab was noisy and rattled, the air conditioning was long dead, and the paint was a patchwork of faded red and rust. But it worked. A hydraulic line blew one afternoon, spraying hot oil all over the side of the machine. I shut it down, drove to town for a new hose, and was running again in 2 hours. A drive belt for the straw chopper snapped. I had a spare I'd bought for $10, and I replaced it myself in the field. Meanwhile, Rich Peterson's brand-new IH915 went down. A sophisticated electronic sensor in the grain head failed. He couldn't bypass it. The machine just sat there, dead in the middle of a row. The dealer had to send a specialist from Waterloo, and the part was on backorder for 3 days. 3 beautiful sunny harvest days. Lost. I saw Rich standing by the side of the road, smoking a cigarette, just staring at his $1 million lawn ornament, while my ugly, loud, resurrected Massey kept chewing through the corn. He didn't look at me as I drove past, the rumble of my Perkins V8 a testament to a different kind of progress. The cracks in the golden age began to appear slowly, then all at once. The price of diesel fuel doubled, then nearly tripled by the end of the decade. For me, it was a nuisance. For Rich, with 3 big tractors and a combine that drank 50 gallons in an afternoon, it was a catastrophe. His input costs were soaring. Then came the drought of 1980. The sky turned a hazy, brassy color for weeks on end. Corn leaves curled up tight by midday, the plants stunted and stressed. Yields were cut in half. Grain prices ticked up, but not enough to cover the shortfall and the crushing cost of fuel and fertilizer. The mood at the diner changed. The confident talk of expansion and tax breaks was replaced by hushed, worried conversations about operating loans and cash flow. The word on everyone's lips was interest rates. The Federal Reserve, trying to slay the dragon of inflation, was cranking them up. 7% was a distant memory. The prime rate hit 12%, then 15%, then 18%. The variable rate loans that had fueled the boom were becoming anchors, pulling everyone under. The winter of 1981 was bleak. The first foreclosure notice went up on a farm south of town. It was like a death notice nailed to a tree. People drove by it slowly, nobody saying a word. It was a family that had farmed there for 3 generations. They had bought the neighboring 80 in 76, leveraging everything they had. It was a story being repeated all over the heartland. Rich Peterson's empire crumbled faster than most. It was built on the shakiest foundation of all, the assumption that the good times would never end. His payments to the bank, which had been manageable at 7%, were now impossible at 20%. He was paying more in interest every month than my father had made in a year. The massive new machine shed sat half empty. He'd sold one of the 1066 over the winter just to make a payment. The Steiger was next. I saw him at the co-op one spring morning. The swagger was gone. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes carrying a haunted look I recognized. It was the look of a man trapped, the walls closing in. He was buying a single bag of seed corn, paying for it with a crumpled check. He, who used to buy it by the semi-load. He saw me, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old arrogance, quickly replaced by a profound weariness. He just nodded and walked away. He wasn't the king anymore. He was just another farmer drowning in a sea of red ink. The final blow came in the fall of '82. The bank called his loan. They gave him 90 days to become current, an impossible task. The farm crisis wasn't just a news story from Des Moines anymore, it was here. It was a cancer consuming our community. The sound of the auctioneer's gavel became the soundtrack of our lives, not for celebration, but for dissolution. My farm survived. It didn't boom, but it didn't bust. My cost of operation was low. My 40/20 sipped fuel compared to the new behemoths. The Massey 760, my $100 folly, was my greatest asset. It had no payment book. Its only cost was fuel and the grease on my hands. While my neighbors were selling off 40 acres to pay the interest on the other 80, I was banking my profits. The meager 5% interest that had seemed foolish in 1973 now looked like a stroke of genius. I was solvent. I was free. The storm had arrived, and my little ark, built of old iron and stubbornness, was riding it out. The Peterson Farm auction was held on a cold, windswept Saturday in November. The sky was the color of lead, threatening a wintry mix of rain and sleet. It was a grim mirror of the auction where I'd bought the Massey nearly a decade earlier. The crowd was smaller, the faces etched with worry instead of ambition. They weren't here to buy their dreams, they were here to pick over the bones of a nightmare. Rich's equipment was lined up in the yard he had so carefully graded. The IH-1066, the one he'd bought with such pride, looked tired, its paint faded from sitting outside, its tires caked with the mud of a desperate final harvest. The big Steiger four-wheel drive sat silent, a monument to a credit line that had run dry. Everything was for sale, the tractors, the planters, the massive grain bins, the tools from his workshop, even the Lincoln, now dusty and bearing a small dent in the rear fender. I saw Rich standing near the back of the machine shed, his shoulders slumped inside a thin jacket. He wasn't the confident land baron anymore, he was a ghost at his own funeral. His wife stood beside him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of quiet devastation. People avoided them, not out of malice, but out of a shared, unspoken fear that this could happen to any of them. The auctioneer, the same Bill Haynes, started the sale. His voice lacked its usual fire. There was no cajoling, no hype. It was a somber, methodical process of liquidation. A banker in a suit stood beside him, a clipboard in his hand, ticking off each item as it sold, the numbers representing not profit, but the chipping away of a mountain of debt. The big-ticket items went for pennies on the dollar. The Steiger, which had cost Rich over $100,000, sold for $22. The 1066 fetched less than $10. There was no money in the county. The buyers were mostly dealers from out of state, vultures circling a carcass. I didn't bid on any of it. I didn't need it, and I felt no satisfaction in watching Rich's world be dismantled piece by piece. It was a tragedy, a cautionary tale written in diesel and debt. Then they came to the land. The auctioneer announced the sale of the home quarter section, 160 acres with the house and buildings. This was the heart of it all, the original Peterson farm. The banker started the bidding at what was owed, $700 an acre. A gasp went through the crowd. Just 5 years earlier, land like this was selling for $3,000. Silence. No one moved. No one could. The farmers who were left were clinging to their own land by a thread. They had no cash, no credit. The banker looked nervous. He conferred with the auctioneer. "All right, folks, the bank wants this moved," Bill Haynes announced, his voice strained. "We'll open the bidding at $500 an acre. 500, that's a giveaway." I thought of Rich, of his smug grin at that first auction. I thought of his words, "Grow or die." He had grown, and now he was dying. And I had stayed small, and I had survived. There was no victory in it, only a deep, profound sadness for what had been lost. I raised my hand. 500, I said. My voice was steady, clear in the cold air. Every head turned toward me. The banker's eyes lit up. Rich looked up, his face a mixture of shock and disbelief. "I have 500 from Earl Armstrong. Do I hear 550? The auctioneer's voice found a spark of its old energy. He scanned the crowd. Nothing. The silence stretched. 500 once, 500 twice, sold, for $500 an acre to Earl Armstrong. The gavel fell, and the sound echoed across the empty yard. I had just bought the farm next to mine, the one Rich had built his empire upon, for a fraction of its worth. I walked to the clerk's table, my checkbook in hand. I wasn't just buying land, I was buying the final bitter lesson of the 1980s farm crisis. After I signed the papers, I walked over to Rich. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the gravel, his hands jammed in his pockets. "I'm sorry, Rich," I said quietly. He finally looked up, his eyes glassy. "Sorry. You won, Earl. You were right all along, stubborn old Earl with his pile of junk. You won." "It wasn't a contest," I said. "Look, the bank wants you out by the 1st of the month. That's not right. You and your family can stay in the house. Stay through the winter, get on your feet. We can work something out in the spring." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He was expecting a gloating victor, and instead he found a neighbor. "Why?" he finally whispered. "Because that's what neighbors do," I said. I reached out and shook his hand. His grip was weak, the fire gone. "You can farm that ground for me next year if you want. A sharecrop lease, it'll give you some income." A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He just nodded, unable to speak. I had taken his land, but in that moment, I had given him back a piece of his dignity. The years that followed were a slow healing. The farm crisis left deep scars on Black Hawk County. Fence rows grew up where prosperous farms had once stood. Families moved away, the schools got smaller, and the main street in town had empty storefronts. But the ones who survived, the ones like me who had been cautious, who had mistaken thrift for foolishness, we rebuilt. I farmed my original 240 and the 160 I'd bought from the bank. Rich farmed it for me for 3 years, and we became something like friends. We never talked about the boom years. We talked about the weather, about fixing machinery, about the price of beans. He eventually got a job driving a truck for the co-op, and his family moved to town. He was humbled, but he wasn't broken. My son, David, grew up turning wrenches alongside me in the shop. He never knew the fever of the 70s, only the hard-won lessons of the 80s. I taught him how to weld, how to time an engine, how to listen for the subtle change in a machine's sound that tells you something is wrong. I taught him that the shiny paint on a new tractor was just a cover for a payment book that owned you, not the other way around. One fall afternoon, when David was about 16, we were getting the Massey 760 ready for harvest. We didn't need it anymore. I'd since bought a newer, more reliable John Deere combine at another foreclosure auction, paying cash, but I could never bring myself to sell the old Massey. It was my monument. It sat in the back of the shed, a sleeping giant. "Dad, why do we keep this old thing?" David asked, covered in grease from lubing the feeder house chain. "It's loud, it's slow, and it breaks down." I stopped what I was doing and looked at the machine. I saw the patch on the engine block, a faint outline of Gus's masterful welds. I saw the hydraulic hose I'd replaced in the field, the dent in the fender from a fence post I'd backed into. It wasn't just a combine. It was my story. "That machine," I said, pointing with my wrench, "taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. It's not about how fast you go. It's not about how big you get. It's about what you own, truly own. When the storm comes, and it always comes, the only thing that will keep you standing is a solid foundation, not a pile of debt." I walked over and laid a hand on the massive V8 engine. It was cold. This engine was dead. Everyone said it was scrap. They laughed at me. But we brought it back. We owe nothing on it. It will run today, tomorrow, and 10 years from now, because we know how to fix it with our own 2 hands. That's freedom, son. That's more valuable than all the new iron in the world. I climbed into the cab, the same dusty, cracked seat. I turned the key. The starter groaned, and the big Perkins V8 roared to life, filling the machine shed with its deep, familiar thunder. It was the sound of survival, the sound of independence. It was the sound of an empire built not on credit, but on character, harvested one debt-free acre at a time.